Okay, guys, good morning from North Wales. I just would like to clarify a couple of things around temperature and humidity. Again, just recapping on this, because in a terrarium like this, so where it is ecologically based, um, there is no static temperature. So, like warm side temperature and cool side temperature reading, they're not static. They change all the time. And the reasons why that is because there's so many variables to consider when you are um, executing an ecological design like this, for example. So this is kind of spurred on from a query I was asked by one of my followers on YouTube. So it's just to I just thought I'd shoot a quick video to kind of look into, well, why aren't the temperatures static all the time? So, like, people, you know, I'm involved with a couple of husbandry groups on social media, and I see on there that people sometimes freak out if the temperature isn't high enough or low enough, or and then they go to all sorts of efforts to try and keep that temperature to the same temperature all the time. I mean, it does depend on the setup. If you're using sterile setups with non-loose substrate, then, and if you're a beginner into the hobby, then totally that is fine. I agree with having the maximum and minimum kind of like standards, really, which are stated in the care guides. However, for ecological setups like this, and this is where there isn't really enough kind of care guides or such, so you're having to figure it out on your own, unless, I mean, not entirely on your own. There is support available through networking on social media. But there is limitations on the research that's been made for this kind of thing. So this is kind of like an experiment, really, going forward. But anyway, just before I go off on a major tangent, so why isn't the temperature and humidity always the same in this terrarium? So, like, the hot side, the cooler side. Now, let's take a look at the soil. So the soil is like the foundation of the terrarium. We have the drainage layer at the bottom, and then we have the soil layers on top. Now, that in itself enhances terrarium and humidity, because soil contains gases, salts, in other words, scientific terms, sulfates, phosphorus, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and so on. And the purpose of the soil is to break down organic matter and provide nutrients for life above the ground, for example, the plants and the insects, and also the microorganisms that live within the soil. So that in itself regulates temperature and humidity in an ecological terrarium. What else influences temperature and humidity? Plant distribution. So if you have all the plants clustered into one area, for example, it's going to create a sort of a humidity pockets and climate in that area. And if you have them spread out, because remember, plants, they give off gases such as oxygen, and they take in carbon dioxide. So that process as well, the photosynthesis and whatnot, that can influence temperature and humidity. The time of day. So if we look at the weather outside, and it will influence the room temperature, that also affects the temperature and humidity inside the terrarium like this. There's also fans installed, which are currently on. You can see the little flickering of the leaves. The ventilation, so the mesh lid, the extra ventilation provided by the fans, the air movement, air going in and air getting sucked out, that also will affect temperature and humidity. So although the temperature is set, is controlled, so the temperature of the heat source, which is that lamp there, is controlled by a thermostat, which is set at its temperature of around 30 in the summer, and then when it goes towards winter and to encourage brumation, I dim the dial down. Or if it gets ridiculously hot, you know, so say if it's like outside 35 degrees and then inside it's a lot warmer, so then I will dip the dial down. So yeah, it's good to have a thermostat for safety purposes, really. Though one could argue that these fans are temperature controlled, so the hotter the air, the faster the speed of the fans. So one could argue whether that in itself would justify the use of not having a thermostat. But anyway, that's another topic again. But for peace of mind, I'm just sticking to my thermostat, a dimmer thermostat, to regulate the temperature for safety, really. But in an ecological, if you think of the wild, say walking through a forest, you're going to get different temperature pockets. You know, outside in the open, it's going to be different to what it is under the trees, and the ground temperature as well will differ. So the air temperature inside this terrarium at this moment in time, if we just look at where, so I mean, these orange things here are air comfort devices, which are high-tech terrarium designed temperature and humidity measuring devices. They give specific info, which I've mentioned in the previous video, so I'm not going to go into too much into that now. But if we just go by the spot readings of the probe sensors for now, so I've got one on the warmer side there, and then there's one just placed on the cooler side. So these dials, where they're placed, so not, you know, so if they were placed directly on top of the soil, well, that would give an inaccurate reading of the air temperature, because the temperature and humidity on the ground would affect the reading of that. So the reason I've placed them slightly in the shade, in sort of above the ground, is to give more accurate reading. But I've also got these devices here which are hung, so they're in the air kind of, and then they give regular readings through an app on temperature and humidity. So at this moment of time in the day, and I think it's around 11:30 in the morning, so humidity, we'll forget about that for now because that's just on a certain spot. But temperature, so this is on the cool side. So the temperature on the cool side, so where that probe is there, the air temperature is 24.8. And then on the warm side, it's 31.2, which is, you know, it's fine. So then we've got a distinct warm end and a cool end. However, let's look at the spot temperatures. Now, these gadgets here will give a slightly different reading again. The hottest at this time of year, so we're in early September, so we're heading towards autumn. bearing in mind that this is on a climate plan based on weather data from a area in their wild habitat in Pakistan. So I set all the lighting to, they're connected to digital timers, so I adjust the timers every month to mimic the daytime hours of sun in the wild habitat. It's not to the exact minute, obviously, but you know, so now we're in September. There is, so the timers, so the lights, you know, they come on at a slightly later time in the morning and they go off at slightly earlier time in the evening than what they were in, say, August and July and so on. So every month that changes. And again, so that will influence temperature and humidity in this kind of setup. So if we look at spot temperatures now, so spot temperatures, a good accurate way of reading spot temperatures is to buy a infrared smart sensor thermometer. So let's have a look. So let's just randomly check the spot temperature of this little area here, this little shady spot. So there we have, it's 22.1 degrees C. So even though the air temperature is slightly higher, the spot temperature on the ground is different. Just on that grassy area there, it's 22.9. So notice how the higher up, the closer that we get to this light source, which does give off a little bit of heat, but it's not as strong as, say, the Arcadia Jungle Dawn. So it kind of gives off a cooler. The LEDs don't heat up as warm as the Jungle Dawns, I've noticed. So, but this, so if we go higher up, so if we measure the temperature on that spot there, just on the back there, so because it's higher up, 27.3, so, you know, which kind of mimics the air temperature of this zone as well. And then if we go into this sort of grassy, densely vegetated area here, so let's have a look in that little spot down there. It's 25.1. Then we've got more areas here. There's a little, try and get the pebble. 24.3. Warm side. 24.9. Shady spot on the warm side, so in one of the caves under the slate. 25. And then let's get closer to the lamp. Now we're getting into the 30s. And then the higher up we go, the closer to the lamp and the hotter it gets. Okay. So directly under the UVB, which again gives off a little bit deep. So 33. So the UVB light source is obviously cooler heat emissions than the halogen. It's pretty stating the obvious, really, because the halogen does give off deep penetrating heat. So yeah, so it is a kind of, when people think, oh, there should be, you know, this temperature on the hot side and then this temperature on the cold side, well, in this kind of terrarium, that doesn't apply, really. because there's so many factors that influence the temperature and humidity. Humidity is roughly in the middle of the day at this time. It can be sort of to low 40s. Then later on in the day it gets about 50s, 60s, even in the evening. Can get up to 70% on the dry zone overnight when there's no heat sources or anything on. But then if I missed the enclosure to water the plants and whatnot, and to mimic rainfall, that also will affect the humidity and will also enhance the temperature as well. So there are lots of variables when you are considering temperature and humidity in an ecological terrarium such as this. So I hope that gives you a little bit of insight, following on from a couple of previous videos on terrarium climate. But the whole ecological processes associated with this design, basically it kind of breaks the rules around standard care guide temperature and humidity you know, what's instructed generally, and it mimics their wild habitat, really not exact obviously, but you know, if you think of in the wild, temperature and humidity varies so much, and the only way we can figure that out is to literally go out to their habitat and take measurements and readings. But then again, that varies again, different times of day, different times of year, different seasons, all the rest. So in this kind of terrarium, the size of the terrarium will influence the terrarium temperature and humidity as well. So if you have a smaller terrarium, then you need to consider the sort of how do I explain this bit now? So like in a large terrarium like this, there's kind of there's more space for like thermal gradients and thermal energy to kind of move around, and air and whatnot. And if you have a smaller terrarium, obviously there's going to be less space for kind of temperature regulation driven by plants and soil and physical structures such as the logs and the rocks and so on. But that doesn't mean to say that you can't provide a safe environment for your gecko or reptile in a smaller terrarium, but you just have to bear in mind those variables, that the smaller the terrarium, the more intense the climate may be, unless you have a lower wattage bulb for your heat source and set it at a low setting on the thermostat. But generally I would say go bigger and allow that energy just to flow from bottom to top and reverse. Okay guys, so that is all for now, and I thought this was just going to be a quick video, but it's ended up being nearly 20 minutes. But anyway, that's cool. I just wanted to clarify that matter, so I hope it has cleared up a few niggles in people's minds. If yeah, so anyway, over and out guys, see you soon.